My name is David Mitchell, and until 6 months ago, I was a struggling college graduate working dead-end jobs in Chicago, wondering if I'd ever find my place in the world. That all changed when I received a call from a lawyer in rural Illinois about an inheritance I never expected. My great-uncle Walter had died at 93, leaving me his 80-acre farm and everything on it. I barely remembered Uncle Walter from childhood visits. He was a quiet, eccentric man who lived alone and rarely spoke about his past. My parents had always described him as the family hermit, someone who'd chosen isolation over connection. The lawyer, Mr. Henderson, was matter-of-fact about the inheritance. Your uncle left specific instructions that the property should go to you, Mr. Mitchell. He said you were the only one in the family who might appreciate what he was leaving behind. I drove down from Chicago on a gray October morning, not sure what to expect. The farm was more run down than I'd remembered from childhood visits. The farmhouse needed significant repairs, the barn was leaning precariously, and weeds had overtaken what had once been productive fields. But it was the old tractor sitting in the barn that caught my attention. It was a 1950s International Harvester, covered in rust and bird droppings, looking like it hadn't run in decades. The tires were flat, the paint was gone, and vines had grown through the engine compartment. Mr. Henderson handed me the keys and a thick envelope. Your uncle left this for you as well. He said not to open it until you'd spent some time on the property. As I stood in that dusty barn, surrounded by the remnants of my uncle's life, I had no idea that I was about to embark on the most extraordinary adventure of my life. The rusty tractor would prove to be far more than just old farm equipment. Chapter 2. Settling in. The first few weeks on the farm were overwhelming. The house had been empty for months, and everything needed attention. I spent my days cleaning, making basic repairs, and trying to figure out what to do with 80 acres of overgrown farmland. I'd taken a leave of absence from my job in Chicago, telling myself I'd stay just long enough to get the property ready to sell. But something about the place was growing on. The silence was profound after years of city noise, and there was something peaceful about watching the sunrise over fields that had been in my family for generations. The tractor remained in the barn, a constant reminder of work that needed to be done. I'd grown up around machinery. My father had been a mechanic, so I understood the basics of engines and repair work. But this old International Harvester was in rough shape, and I wasn't sure it was worth the effort to restore. Still, I found myself drawn to it. During breaks from house repairs, I'd wander into the barn and study the machine, imagining what it must have looked like when Uncle Walter first bought it. There were signs that he'd maintained it carefully for many years before finally giving up on it. I finally opened Uncle Walter's envelope on a rainy Thursday evening. Inside was a handwritten letter that was both cryptic and intriguing. David, if you're reading this, you've decided to stay at the farm long enough to get curious about the old tractor. Good. That machine holds more than just memories. It holds the key to understanding why I chose this life of solitude. When you're ready to learn the truth about our family, start with the engine. Look carefully, and you'll find what I've been protecting all these years. Trust no one with what you discover until you understand its full significance. The letter was signed simply, Uncle Walter, and dated just 3 months before his death. Chapter 3. The restoration begins. Uncle Walter's cryptic letter haunted me for days. What could he have hidden in an old tractor, and why all the secrecy? I decided the only way to find answers was to start working on the machine and see what I could discover. I began by clearing the vines and debris from around the tractor. Underneath the rust and grime, I could see that it had once been a beautiful machine. The International Harvester Farmall series had been the backbone of American agriculture for decades, and this particular model would have been state-of-the-art when Uncle Walter bought it. The engine was completely seized, which meant I'd have to disassemble it completely to have any hope of getting it running again. I ordered service manuals and began the slow process of taking apart decades of neglect. As I worked, I found evidence of Uncle Walter's careful maintenance. Despite its current condition, the tractor had been lovingly cared for during its working years. Parts were properly lubricated, bolts were correctly torqued, and everything showed signs of regular attention. But there were also anomalies. Some components had been modified in ways that didn't match the factory specifications. Brackets had been added, wiring had been rerouted, and there were mounting points for equipment that should never have been on a farm tractor. The biggest surprise came when I started removing the engine. Hidden beneath years of accumulated grease and dirt, I found a small metal compartment that had been welded into the engine casting. It was so well concealed that I almost missed it entirely. The compartment was sealed with a waterproof gasket and secured with a lock that looked far more sophisticated than anything that belonged on farm equipment. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, was something that made my hands shake with excitement. It was a map, hand-drawn on heavy paper that had been treated to resist moisture and age. But this wasn't just any map. It showed the layout of my uncle's farm with incredible detail, including landmarks and measurements that suggested something valuable was hidden somewhere on the property. Chapter 4. Decoding the map was unlike anything I'd ever seen. It showed not just the current layout of Uncle Walter's farm, but also historical features that no longer existed. There were notations for old fence lines, demolished buildings, and even trees that had been cut down decades ago. Most intriguingly, the map included a series of symbols and measurements that clearly indicated specific locations. Red X marks were scattered across the property, each accompanied by cryptic notations like 12 paces north of the old oak and beneath the stone foundation. I spent hours comparing the map to the actual landscape, trying to understand what Uncle Walter had been documenting. Some of the landmarks were easy to identify: the barn, the house, the old well, but others required careful exploration to locate. The map also included what appeared to be a legend, though the symbols were unlike anything I recognized. There were drawings that looked like geometric shapes, numbers that might have been coordinates, and notations in what appeared to be a simple code. One thing was clear: Uncle Walter had spent considerable time and effort creating this map. The level of detail suggested years of careful observation and measurement. This wasn't a casual project. It was the work of someone who was documenting something extremely important. I decided to start with the most obvious landmark on the map: a large red X located near what the drawing indicated was the old foundation. I knew there were stone ruins in the northeast corner of the property, remnants of what had once been a barn that had burned down before I was born. Armed with a metal detector I'd borrowed from a neighbor and a shovel, I set out to investigate my first potential treasure site. I had no idea what I was looking for, but Uncle Walter's letter had made it clear that whatever he'd hidden was significant enough to justify a lifetime of secrecy. The October afternoon was perfect for outdoor work, and as I walked across the fields toward the old foundation, I felt like a real treasure hunter for the first time in my life. Chapter 5. The First Discovery. The old foundation was more extensive than I'd realized. What I'd always assumed were random stone piles were actually the remains of a substantial structure. According to the map, I needed to locate a point 12 paces north of the largest cornerstone. Finding the largest cornerstone took some exploration, but eventually I identified a massive granite block that clearly marked what had once been the northwest corner of the building. 12 paces north brought me to an area that looked unremarkable, just grass and weeds growing over what appeared to be undisturbed soil. The metal detector immediately started beeping. Whatever was buried here was substantial and metallic. I began digging carefully, not wanting to damage whatever Uncle Walter had hidden. 3 feet down, my shovel struck something hard. More careful excavation revealed a metal box, roughly the size of a briefcase, wrapped in heavy plastic and sealed with waterproof tape. The box itself was made of stainless steel and showed no signs of corrosion despite being buried for what must have been decades. Inside the box, I found documents that made my head spin. There were military records, photographs, and correspondence that painted a picture of Uncle Walter I'd never imagined. He hadn't been a simple farmer at all. He'd been a military intelligence officer during World War II and the Korean War. The photographs showed him in uniform, standing with other soldiers in locations I couldn't identify. The documents included commendations for bravery, security clearances for classified operations, and correspondence with government officials that suggested he'd been involved in activities far beyond normal military service. But the most shocking discovery was a letter from the U.S. Treasury Department, dated 1953, thanking Uncle Walter for his invaluable assistance in recovering assets of strategic importance to national security. The letter was signed by officials whose names I recognized from history books. At the bottom of the box was another map, this one showing not just Uncle Walter's farm, but the entire surrounding area. This map had even more red X marks, suggesting that whatever Uncle Walter had been hiding was much larger than I'd initially thought. Chapter 6. The Revelation. The documents I'd found painted a picture of Uncle Walter that was completely different from the quiet farmer. According to his military records, he'd been part of a special intelligence unit that had operated behind enemy lines during World War II, recovering stolen Nazi gold and artwork that had been hidden across Europe. After the war, he'd continued working for the government, tracking down war criminals and recovering assets that had been looted during the conflict. The Treasury Department letter suggested that he'd been instrumental in locating and securing millions of dollars worth of stolen treasures. But the most intriguing document was a report dated 1952 that described the recovery of a significant cache of precious metals and artifacts from a location in Illinois. The report was heavily redacted, but it clearly indicated that Uncle Walter had been involved in bringing something valuable to the United States. I spent the evening studying the new map, comparing it to the one I'd found in the tractor. The additional red X marks were scattered across a much wider area, including locations on neighboring properties, and even some that appeared to be in the nearby state forest. One notation on the map caught my attention: primary cache, secure location, full inventory attached. The location was marked with a double red X, and appeared to be somewhere in the woods behind Uncle Walter's property. I realized I was looking at evidence of one of the largest treasure recoveries in history, and Uncle Walter had apparently brought at least part of it to his farm in Illinois. The question was, how much was still here, and why had he kept it secret for so many decades? The next morning, I called in sick to my job in Chicago and committed to staying on the farm until I could unravel the full extent of Uncle Walter's secret. I was no longer just inheriting a farm. I was inheriting a mystery that could change my life. Armed with both maps and a growing sense of excitement, I prepared to search for what Uncle Walter had called the primary cache. Chapter 7. The hunt intensifies. The location of the primary cache was marked on the map as being approximately half a mile into the woods behind Uncle Walter's property. The area was part of a state forest that bordered his farm, and according to the notations, the cache was hidden beneath the lightning oak, 20 paces east. I'd grown up hearing stories about the lightning, a massive tree that had been struck by lightning multiple times but somehow continued to survive. Local folklore claimed it was over 200 years old and had served as a landmark for settlers traveling through the area. Finding the tree was easier than I'd expected. It stood in a small clearing, its distinctive split trunk making it unmistakable. The lightning damage had created a natural hollow in the base of the tree, and I could see why Uncle Walter might have chosen this location for hiding something valuable. 20 paces east of the tree brought me to an area that looked completely undisturbed. There were no obvious signs that anyone had ever dug here, but the metal detector immediately indicated the presence of something large and metallic, buried several feet underground. The excavation took most of the afternoon. At 6 feet down, I hit something that made a distinctly different sound when struck with the shovel. More careful digging revealed what appeared to be the top of a large metal container, possibly a military surplus storage crate. The container was massive, roughly the size of a coffin, and clearly designed for long-term storage. It was sealed with multiple locks and wrapped in heavy waterproof material that had protected it from decades of moisture and soil contact. Getting it out of the hole required a come-along and several hours of careful work. By the time I had it on the surface, the sun was setting, and I was exhausted. But the anticipation of discovering what Uncle Walter had hidden for so many years kept me going. The locks were substantial, but I'd found a key ring among the documents in the first cache. One of the keys fit perfectly, and the container opened with a satisfying click that echoed through the quiet forest. What I found inside took my breath away. Chapter 8. The treasure. The container held treasures that belonged in a museum. There were gold coins from multiple countries and historical periods, jewelry that sparkled even in the fading daylight, and artifacts that I recognized from history books about World War II. But it wasn't just the monetary value that amazed me, it was the historical significance. There were Nazi medals and insignia, obviously taken as war trophies. There were pieces of art that looked like they belonged in European palaces, and there were documents in multiple languages that appeared to be ownership records and provenance certificates. At the top of the container was a detailed inventory, written in Uncle Walter's careful handwriting. The list included descriptions of each item, estimated values, and notations about their historical significance. According to his calculations, the contents of this single container were worth several $1 million. But there was also a letter addressed to me specifically. David, if you've found this cache, you've proven that you have the persistence and intelligence to handle what I'm entrusting to you. This treasure represents only a fraction of what our unit recovered during and after the war. Most of it was returned to its rightful owners or donated to museums, but some items had no clear provenance or were too dangerous to surface through official channels. I've spent 60 years protecting these artifacts, waiting for the right time and the right person to decide their ultimate fate. The government knows about some of what we recovered, but not all of it. There are people who would kill for what you found, and there are others who would use it for purposes that would dishonor the memory of those who died protecting it. The choice is yours now. You can turn everything over to the authorities, sell it for personal gain, or find a way to ensure that these treasures serve a greater purpose. I trust you to make the right decision. As I sat in the gathering darkness, surrounded by treasures that represented both incredible wealth and enormous responsibility, I realized that my inheritance was far more complex than I'd ever imagined. Chapter 9. The Investigation. I spent the next several days researching the items I'd found, trying to understand their origins and significance. Many of the pieces had markings or documentation that allowed me to trace their histories, and what I discovered was both fascinating and troubling. Several of the artworks had been stolen from Jewish families during the Holocaust. The provenance documents showed a clear chain of theft, from the original owners through various Nazi officials, and eventually to the cache that Uncle Walter's unit had recovered. Other items appeared to have been part of official Nazi treasuries or military reserves. Gold coins bore the stamps of the German Reichsbank, and some of the jewelry had obviously been crafted for high-ranking party officials. But perhaps most significantly, I found evidence that Uncle Walter's unit had been part of a larger operation to recover and secure Nazi assets before they could be used to fund post-war criminal activities. The document suggested that many former Nazis had attempted to use hidden treasures to establish new identities and continue their activities in other countries. I also discovered that I wasn't the only one who knew about Uncle Walter's activities. Internet searches revealed that several historical researchers had written about the Illinois Cache, a legendary treasure that was rumored to have been hidden by American intelligence officers after the war. More troubling, I found evidence that treasure hunters and criminal organizations had been searching for Uncle Walter's cache for decades. There were forum posts and news articles about mysterious activities in the area, unexplained excavations, and even reports of people asking questions about Uncle Walter in the years before his death. I realized that by uncovering the treasure, I might have put myself in danger. If there were people who had been searching for this cache for 60 years, they wouldn't hesitate to take it from someone who had stumbled onto it by accident. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. I was going to find out exactly who else knew about Uncle Walter's secret, and I was going to make sure the treasure ended up where it belonged. Chapter 10. The Watchers. My research had made me paranoid, and that paranoia probably saved my life. I started noticing things that I'd previously overlooked. Cars that drove past the farm too slowly, people asking casual questions about Uncle Walter in town, and phone calls that ended abruptly when I answered. The breakthrough came when I found Uncle Walter's personal journals hidden in the farmhouse attic. He'd been keeping detailed records not just of the treasure, but of people who had been searching for it over the decades. According to his notes, at least 3 different groups had been actively hunting for the cache. There was a legitimate historical research organization that wanted to return stolen artifacts to their rightful owners. There was a criminal syndicate that viewed the treasure as funding for ongoing illegal activities. And most troubling, there was a group of Nazi sympathizers who believed the cache contained evidence that could be used to rehabilitate the reputation of war criminals. Uncle Walter had been playing a careful game for 60 years, feeding false information to all 3 groups while protecting the real location of the treasure. He'd even staged fake excavations and planted false caches to throw searchers off the trail. But his death had changed the equation. Without Uncle Walter's misdirection, the various groups were closing in on the real location. According to his final journal entries, he'd been aware that his time was running out and had chosen me as his heir, specifically because he believed I could handle the responsibility. The journals also revealed that Uncle Walter had been in contact with legitimate authorities about eventually turning over the treasure. He'd been working with the FBI's art crime team and several international organizations dedicated to returning stolen cultural artifacts to their rightful owners. Most importantly, I found contact information for Agent Sarah Morrison, an FBI specialist who had been Uncle Walter's primary contact within the government. According to his notes, she was one of the few people who knew the full extent of what he'd been protecting. I decided it was time to make contact with the authorities and get professional help in handling the situation. But first, I needed to secure the treasure and make sure it couldn't fall into the wrong hands. Chapter 11. The Alliance Agent Morrison arrived at the farm within hours of my phone call. She was a serious woman in her 40s, who clearly understood the significance of what I'd discovered. More importantly, she confirmed that Uncle Walter had been working with the FBI for years to plan the eventual disposition of the treasure. "Your uncle was a patriot and a hero," she told me as we sat in the farmhouse kitchen. "He could have kept that treasure for himself or sold it decades ago. Instead, he spent his life protecting it and making sure it would eventually be returned to where it belonged." Agent Morrison explained that the FBI had been tracking the various groups that were searching for Uncle Walter's cache. They'd been waiting for him to make contact about turning over the treasure, but his sudden death had complicated their plan. "We know there are at least 2 criminal organizations that have been closing in on this location," she said. "Now that you've actually found the cache, you're in real danger. We need to move quickly to secure everything and get you to safety." Over the next several hours, Agent Morrison and a team of federal agents carefully excavated and cataloged the entire treasure. The final inventory was staggering: over $4 million in gold and precious stones, plus artifacts whose historical value was incalculable. But Agent Morrison also had news about the other caches marked on Uncle Walter's maps. "Your uncle wasn't just protecting one treasure," she explained. "Over the years, he helped recover and secure multiple Nazi caches. Some have already been returned to their rightful owners, but others are still hidden." She showed me a map that included not just Uncle Walter's farm, but locations across 3 states where additional treasures were hidden. "Your uncle left instructions that you should be given the opportunity to help us recover the remaining caches, if you're willing." I looked at the map, realizing that my inheritance included not just one treasure, but responsibility for protecting multiple caches that represented millions of dollars and countless pieces of stolen history. "What exactly are you asking me to help us finish what your uncle started? Help us find the remaining treasures and make sure they're returned to where they belong." Chapter 12. The Mission. Over the next 6 months, I became an unofficial consultant to the FBI's art crime team. Using Uncle Walter's maps and journals, we located and recovered 4 additional caches hidden across Illinois, Indiana, and Wisconsin. Each recovery was like stepping into history. We found artwork that had been stolen from museums in Paris, gold that had been looted from occupied territories, and documents that provided evidence of war crimes that had never been prosecuted. But we also discovered that Uncle Walter's network had been much larger than anyone had realized. He'd been part of a group of veterans who had dedicated their post-war lives to tracking down and securing Nazi assets. Some had worked openly with the government, while others, like Uncle Walter, had operated in secret to protect themselves and their families. The most significant discovery came from a cache hidden in Wisconsin. Along with the usual gold and artifacts, we found a complete archive of documents that detailed the post-war activities of Nazi war criminals who had escaped to South America. The information led to the arrest of several people who had been living under false identities for decades. Agent Morrison kept me informed about the disposition of the treasures we recovered. Most of the artwork was returned to museums or the families of its original owners. The gold was turned over to international organizations that used it to fund Holocaust education and remembrance programs. But perhaps most satisfying was learning about the impact our work was having on real people. I received letters from families who had been reunited with heirlooms they thought were lost forever. Museums sent photographs of exhibits featuring artwork that we'd helped recover. As winter turned to spring, I made a decision about my future. I wasn't going back to Chicago or my old job. Uncle Walter's farm had become my home, and his mission had become my purpose. I enrolled in graduate school to study art history and museum conservation, preparing for a career in recovering and protecting cultural artifacts. The farm would remain my base of operations, but my real work continuing Uncle Walter's legacy. Chapter 13. The Legacy. Today, 2 years after finding that first map in the tractor engine, I'm still living on Uncle Walter's farm. The old International harvester is fully restored and running perfectly, though it now serves more as a symbol than a working machine. The farm itself has been transformed into a research center dedicated to recovering stolen cultural artifacts. Agent Morrison helped me establish connections with international organizations that track looted art and historical treasures, and I've become part of a global network of people working to right the wrongs of the past. I've learned that Uncle Walter's story wasn't unique. Thousands of American servicemen participated in the recovery of Nazi treasures during and after World War II. Most of them turned everything over to the authorities immediately, but some, like Uncle Walter, found themselves protecting items that were too sensitive or too dangerous to surface through official channels. The rusty tractor that started this whole adventure now sits in a place of honor in my restored barn. Visitors to the research center always ask about it, and I love telling the story of how a simple inheritance led to the discovery of one of the largest treasure recoveries in American history. But the real treasure wasn't the gold or the artwork. It was learning about Uncle Walter's true character and finding my own purpose in life. He'd spent 60 years protecting history, and now I get to spend my life returning that history to where it belongs. The maps are all gone now, their secrets revealed and their treasures recovered. But Uncle Walter's journals continue to provide leads on other caches and other mysteries that need solving. The work he started will probably continue for generations. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd never decided to restore that old tractor, if I'd just sold the farm and returned to my old life in Chicago. But I think Uncle Walter knew exactly what he was doing when he chose me as his heir. He wasn't just leaving me property, he was leaving me a mission that would give my life meaning and purpose. The cornfield is productive again, the farmhouse is fully restored, and the barn houses both the old tractor and a modern research facility. Uncle Walter would be proud of what his inheritance. Thank you for listening to my story about how a rusty tractor and a hidden map changed my entire life. It's been an incredible journey from inheriting what I thought was just an old farm to discovering that I was inheriting a piece of history and a mission that continues to this day. I'd love to hear from listeners around the world. Please let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and whether you've ever discovered something unexpected that changed your life's direction. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories about family secrets, hidden treasures, and the amazing things that can happen when you're willing to dig a little deeper into the past.